Kaladin stood at the edge of the chasm, feeling the dim glow of the distant stormlight flicker within him, a presence he was still getting used to. It had been a few days since he'd bonded with Syl, and every time he thought he understood the power he had gained, it seemed like there was something new to discover. Tonight, he was determined to learn more, to test the limits of what he could do. And he had two willing partners by his side, Sigzil and Lopen, who had agreed to help him train, though they had no idea what was in store. Syl fluttered around him in her usual way, a flicker of light and grace, ever the gentle guide. "You're ready," she said, her voice light and encouraging. "But remember, it's not about rushing. Focus. Let the stormlight flow into you, and trust it." Kaladin nodded, though he could feel the excitement building within him. This was their secret, tucked away in the dim-lit chasms, far from the prying eyes of Gaz and the scouts under Sadeas' command. They had managed to slip away unnoticed, with no one the wiser about their little training session. It was the perfect setting, quiet, mysterious, and full of possibilities. Lopen, who had never been one to stay still for long, was already bouncing on his feet, looking as though he couldn't wait to get started. "All right, Cal, show us what you can do. You've been talking about this Windrunner stuff for days now. Time to see it in action." His voice was filled with the usual exuberance, but there was a twinkle in his eyes that matched Kaladin's own curiosity. Sigzil, ever the practical one, stepped up beside Kaladin with a grin, though his eyes held a hint of skepticism. "Just be careful. We don't want to end up getting stuck down here or attracting attention." His voice was calm and measured, the way he always spoke when analyzing the situation. Kaladin looked between the two of them, appreciating their support. It was strange, training with friends, people who cared for him. Even the feeling of having Syl around, offering quiet encouragement, gave him an unfamiliar sense of peace. "I've practiced a little," Kaladin admitted, his hand flexing slightly as he felt the flow of stormlight within him. "But not much. So let's keep it simple. I'll try to run up the wall and see how it feels." Sigzil raised an eyebrow. "Run up the wall? You mean like the stories of the Skybreakers?" Kaladin nodded. "Exactly. But I don't know if it'll work. I'm still figuring it out." Syl buzzed around his head, the feeling of warmth that always accompanied her presence growing stronger. "You can do it, Kaladin," she said, her voice full of encouragement. "Just trust the stormlight. Focus on it. It wants to lift you." Kaladin took a deep breath, feeling the stormlight hum inside him. He could sense the edges of it, something just beyond his reach, like the distant roar of a storm on the horizon. Stepping forward, he focused on the nearest chasm wall, running his fingers along the rough surface before pushing himself into motion. It was awkward at first. His legs pushed forward as though they were supposed to gain traction, but the wall didn't respond. He stumbled forward, arms flailing as his feet slid, barely keeping himself upright. It was not what he had expected. He felt Syl's presence flicker with concern, but it wasn't the panic of failure. No, it was the gentle encouragement to try again. "Don't give up," Syl said, soft as a whisper in his mind. Kaladin sighed and pushed himself back into position. Lopen's laughter rang out, light-hearted but filled with warmth. "Well, I didn't expect you to stick to the wall like a spider, but you've got the right idea." Kaladin shot him a half-hearted glare, but grinned all the same. "Shut up, Lopen." Sigzil, ever the scholar, took a step forward. "Try focusing on the stormlight flowing through you. If you can release it in the right way, it should hold you to the surface. Kaladin turned his attention inward, trying to sense the stormlight coursing through his body. It felt like a current of power, strong and unyielding. It wasn't about strength. He understood that now. It was about focus and understanding. He wasn't just pushing against the wall. He had to align himself with the energy, with the light, and let it carry him upward. Closing his eyes for a moment, he took a deep breath and focused, letting the stormlight swirl around him. He felt it, the way it responded to his thoughts, his intent. He held on to that feeling, focusing on the pull of gravity and how he could use the stormlight to counteract it. And then he did it. His feet hit the wall, and this time they stuck. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Kaladin grinned as he pushed himself upward, his legs working in unison with the stormlight. He scaled the wall in small, uneven steps, like a child learning to walk, but it was progress. He paused halfway up, looking down at the others. Sigzil was watching with a satisfied nod, while Lopen was clapping with exuberance. "I did it," Kaladin said, breathless but elated. "I actually did it." Lopen laughed. "You looked like a chicken trying to fly. But hey, you made it!" Kaladin couldn't help but laugh himself, feeling the joy of the moment swell in his chest. They were out here, in the quiet chasms, hidden from Sadeas men, and they were learning something incredible together. It was a feeling of camaraderie, one that he hadn't truly experienced in a long time. "You're better than I expected, Cal," Sigzil said, smiling at him. "Just don't try to go any higher yet. We don't know the limits of this." Kaladin nodded. "I'll be careful." Syl fluttered around him, her voice light. "You did well, Kaladin. But remember, the power isn't just about you. It's about trusting the stormlight, letting it guide you." Kaladin thought about her words, feeling the bond between them deepening with each passing moment. She had always been there, always guiding him, but now there was a sense of unity, a partnership forged in the depths of the chasms and on the edges of the stormlight. Sigzil looked at Lopen with a bemused expression. "Your turn, Lopen. Show us how it's done." Lopen's grin was wide and mischievous. "You're going to regret that challenge, Sigzil." And with that, Lopen took a running leap at the wall, flailing wildly in the air before crashing into it with an exaggerated grunt. Kaladin and Sigzil burst into laughter, the sound echoing across the chasm as Lopen awkwardly tried to regain his footing, his arms and legs tangled like a puppet on strings. "You did well, Lopen," Kaladin teased, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "Better than I did on my first try." Lopen gave him an exaggerated glare. "Yeah, well, it's harder when you have legs as long as mine. They don't exactly work like yours, Cal." Sigzil chuckled, shaking his head. All right. Let's focus. We can't waste too much time." But that was a good first step. Kaladin, still high on the excitement of his success, nodded. There was something about this moment, the thrill of discovering new powers, the camaraderie of his friends, the light-hearted teasing, all of it mixed together in a way that made the dangerous world outside seem far away. For a moment, there was nothing but the chasm, the soft glow of stormlight, and the simple joy of learning together. And Kaladin couldn't remember the last time he had felt so at ease. Kaladin stood on the wall, his hands pressed against the rough surface as he steadied himself. The chasm stretched out below him, its dark depths a reminder of how precarious his position was. But the thrill of discovery still surged through him, pushing away any lingering hesitation. Lopen had finally managed to scale part of the wall, though his movements had been less than graceful. He had clambered up a few feet, his legs sticking awkwardly to the surface, before he slid back down with an exaggerated groan. "This is harder than it looks," he muttered, adjusting his shoulder in mock frustration. Kaladin couldn't help but laugh again. "It's not about how hard it looks. It's about feeling the stormlight. You have to focus on how it flows through you." Lopen pouted and shook his head. "You make it sound so simple. You must be holding out on us, Kaladin." Sigzil, standing at the bottom of the chasm, chuckled softly. "He's not holding out on anyone, Lopen. He's just got the hang of it faster than you." Kaladin lowered himself to the ground, carefully stepping away from the wall and feeling the last remnants of stormlight fade from his hands. "I don't know about the hang of it, but I do think I'm starting to get the feel for it." Syl fluttered around him, her light glinting in the dim chasm light. "You did well, Kaladin. That was better than I thought you'd manage the first time." Her voice was full of warmth, and there was pride in her tone. Kaladin smiled softly, grateful for her words. She had always been patient with him, and her encouragement was as much a part of this bond as the power itself. "So, what next?" Lopen asked, his enthusiasm unrelenting. "Can we try some jumping? Can you make us fly like the stories say windrunners do?" Kaladin laughed at the thought, his breath still coming a little quicker than usual. "I don't know about flying, Lopen. I think that's pushing it." Sigzil was looking up thoughtfully, clearly interested, but more cautious. "I don't know if you should try that just yet, Kaladin. You're still learning, and we don't know how far you can push yourself." "I agree with Sigzil," Syl added, her voice thoughtful. "Don't rush it. You're still getting the feel for how your powers work." Kaladin nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, you're right. Let's stick to something simpler for now. Maybe a longer jump, just to see how far I can go." Lopen's eyes sparkled. "A jump? All right. I'm game. I'll jump farther than you." Kaladin shook his head, chuckling. "Not so fast, Lopen. I'm testing this one first." He turned and faced the wall again, mentally preparing himself. He had scaled it before, but now he wanted to push the limits of what he could do with a single leap. The chasm stretched out before him, its yawning depths silent but infinite. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. The stormlight thrummed softly in his chest, a rhythmic pulse that was almost calming in its steadiness. Kaladin focused, drawing the light into his limbs, feeling it course through his body. This time, instead of trying to move his legs first, he imagined the stormlight lifting him, like a gust of wind, pushing him upward. Taking a deep breath, he crouched down slightly, and then leapt, his legs propelling him upward with a surprising force. The wind rushed past him as he flew, feeling the stormlight catch beneath him, lifting him higher and higher. For a brief moment, the chasm walls seemed to blur as he rose, the thrill of the jump rushing through him like a wave. He landed smoothly on a higher ledge, his feet finding purchase on the uneven surface. It wasn't quite as high as he had imagined, but it was a start. He grinned, unable to stop the exhilaration flooding through him. "I did it," he breathed, feeling his heart race. Lopen was beside him almost immediately, eyes wide with admiration. "That was amazing. How'd you do that? You just flew. You were floating." Kaladin chuckled, still catching his breath. "I wouldn't call it flying, Lopen, but it worked." Sigzil, who had been watching from below, crossed his arms. "Well, That was impressive. But don't get too cocky. You still have a lot to learn, Kaladin. Kaladin grinned and glanced over at Sigzil. I know, but it felt like something new, like I'm starting to understand it. Syl hovered nearby, her voice light with encouragement. You're doing great, Kaladin. The Stormlight is yours to command, but you must always listen to it, too. It's not just power, it's a partnership. He nodded, feeling her words resonate deep inside him. It wasn't just about using the Stormlight to accomplish his goals. It was about learning to move in sync with it, to understand its flow and rhythm, just as he would a partner in battle. He could sense it now, the pull of the Stormlight, like an invisible thread connecting him to something far greater than himself. Lopen, still bubbling with excitement, pointed upward. All right, Kaladin, your turn. Can you jump all the way to the ledge over there? Let's see if you can go higher. Kaladin laughed, shaking his head. All right, let's see. This time, he focused more carefully, paying attention to how the Stormlight filled his muscles, how it flowed into his legs and arms. He imagined the jump in his mind, picturing the ledge, feeling the Stormlight lifting him with a greater surge than before. This wasn't about strength. It was about balance, about allowing the Stormlight to guide him where he needed to go. He crouched again and jumped. For a moment, he felt weightless, the wind rushing by his ears, the chasm's walls flashing by. This time, he landed on the next ledge, higher than before, but not by much. Kaladin staggered for a moment, his breath coming fast, but he caught himself. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Lopen was already cheering from below. That was awesome! You got way higher than I thought. Sigzil gave him an approving look. Impressive, but don't get too comfortable. You can only push yourself so far. Kaladin nodded, breathless but smiling. I know. I'm still learning, but it feels good to finally make some progress. The sense of joy and camaraderie that filled the air was infectious. The chasm, dark and vast as it was, had become a place of warmth and laughter, a space where they could learn and grow without the weight of their usual burdens. There was no pressure here, no looming threats, just the quiet bond between friends and the thrill of discovering something new together. Kaladin paused for a moment, taking in the sight of his friends. Sigzil, always practical and grounded, was watching him with a mix of skepticism and pride. Lopen, full of energy and never one to hold back, was grinning ear to ear, eager to try everything for himself. And Syl, of course, was there, offering her quiet guidance and encouragement, her presence like a warm light in the darkness. For the first time in a long time, Kaladin felt at ease. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he was missing, but now that it was here, he never wanted to let it go. Kaladin stood atop the ledge, his heart still racing from the last jump. He could feel the wind rustling through the chasm, the occasional distant rumble of thunder echoing above. It was a stark contrast to the quiet warmth filling him from his friends' laughter and encouragement. The Stormlight coursed through him, a steady pulse that was beginning to feel more natural, more part of him than it had the first time he'd felt it. Lopen, ever the eager one, wasn't satisfied with just watching. He stood below, his arms crossed and his grin wide. All right, Kaladin, enough showing off. Let me see you do that again, but with style. You've got to make it look cool, not just practical. Kaladin smirked. I don't think I'm the one who needs the style lessons, Lopen. Sigzil rolled his eyes, but there was a glint of amusement in his gaze. Don't encourage him, Lopen. We don't need Kaladin trying to do backflips mid-air. The thought of attempting something even more complicated made Kaladin pause, but then the idea of pushing his limits took hold. All right, fine, but no backflips. I'll just try to make it a smoother leap, like I'm gliding instead of jumping. Syl's voice fluttered through his mind, soft and steady. Focus on the flow, Kaladin. It's not about force. It's about control. Let the stormlight be your guide and feel how it can lift you gently, like a leaf on the wind. Her words settled in him like a comforting weight. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the world fade around him. The stormlight was there, flickering inside him, waiting. It was as if the more he practiced, the more it became a part of him, not just a source of power, but a connection. The bond between them was strengthening with every leap, every movement. He focused on the ledge ahead, not just trying to reach it, but allowing the stormlight to carry him to it. The pull of gravity lessened, but never fully absent. He wanted to glide, to feel the stormlight beneath him, lifting him with ease, like he was part of something greater. Kaladin crouched, his feet firm against the stone, and pushed off. The jump felt different this time. The stormlight wrapped around him, soft but strong, guiding his movements. He soared through the air, his feet almost as if they were suspended, and he landed with barely a sound on the ledge. He didn't stumble, didn't catch himself. It was smooth, graceful even. The thrill of it was enough to make him laugh. That was better, Kaladin said, catching his breath, but smiling wide. Lopen was practically bouncing on his feet. That was insane, Kal. You looked like you were floating. You've got to teach me that. Sigzil, though still measured, gave a satisfied nod. It's coming together. You've got more control now. I think we should push it a little further. Try to hold the jump for a longer distance, just to see how far the stormlight can carry you. Kaladin looked down at the ground, nodding thoughtfully. All right, I'll give it a try. No harm in testing the limits. Sigzil and Lopen backed away, giving Kaladin space. The night felt still around them, the air heavy with the scent of stone and the quiet hum of the stormlight. Kaladin could almost feel it, the way the night seemed to hold its breath as he focused. This time, instead of thinking about a ledge, Kaladin imagined the distance between him and Sigzil, a point on the ground, a clear target. He visualized the stormlight carrying him from here to there, a steady and deliberate push. It wasn't just the leap, it was about the distance, about how much he could control. He crouched again, every muscle in his body tense, his mind focused solely on the flow of the stormlight. The connection between him and Syl pulsed gently in the back of his thoughts, a comforting presence that kept him grounded, even as the stormlight lifted him. Kaladin launched himself forward, feeling the stormlight carry him in a smooth arc through the air. He glided farther than he had before, his feet staying steady as he soared towards Sigzil, his target. The wind whipped past him, but it didn't feel like falling. It felt like soaring. He landed lightly, not with a thud, but with a soft, almost effortless movement that sent him tumbling forward just a few steps before he regained his balance. Sigzil clapped, a rare show of approval. That was good. You've really got the hang of it now. You were in the air for longer than I expected. Kaladin smiled, breathless but exhilarated. It didn't feel as difficult this time. It felt smoother. Lopen had already started jumping up and down, excited by the possibility. All right, I'm next. Sigzil, You're up next. Sigzil raised his hands in mock surrender. I'm fine watching you two for now. I'll stick to the ground. Lopen shot him an exaggerated look of disbelief. Coward. All right, I'll show you how it's done. Without waiting for permission, Lopen took a running start at the wall. Kaladin and Sigzil watched as Lopen tried to scale the chasm wall like Kaladin had, but without the same careful control. Lopen's first leap was more chaotic, arms flailing as his feet slid off the surface before he managed to grab hold. That's not quite it, Lopen, Kaladin called out, laughing. Lopen shrugged, but there was no shame in his face, only determination. You make it look too easy, Kal. I'm still figuring it out. Kaladin smiled, feeling lighter than he had in ages. The weight of the world outside the chasms seemed far away now, lost in the quiet camaraderie of the moment. Here, in this hidden place, with his friends, his true friends, Kaladin felt like he could breathe again. Sigzil, ever practical, looked up toward the chasm ceiling. It's getting late, Kaladin. We should probably head back soon. We've spent more time out here than we planned. Kaladin nodded reluctantly, his heart still racing from the excitement. Yeah, I guess you're right. We don't want to overstay our welcome. Lopen groaned. But we're finally having fun. I'll be too tired to try this again tomorrow. Kaladin chuckled and started making his way back down to the base of the chasm. We'll do it again. No rush. We've got time. Syl, her voice as soft as a breeze, drifted around him. It's good to enjoy these moments, Kaladin. Take your time. The Stormlight will be there when you're ready. For once, Kaladin didn't feel burdened by the weight of responsibility or the looming war. In this moment, with his friends, there was only the joy of discovery, the laughter of companions, and the quiet hum of Stormlight flowing through him. And for the first time in a long time, Kaladin felt like he truly belonged. The descent from the ledge was almost as exhilarating as the jumps themselves. Kaladin's feet slid easily down the chasm walls, his boots making soft contact with the stone as he followed the rough path back to where Sigzil and Lopen were already making their way to the base. Syl hovered beside him, her glowing light illuminating the dim chasm walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Well, Lopen said from below, his voice full of energy, this was way more fun than I expected. I thought you windrunners were all about boring, serious training. Kaladin chuckled, the sound still light in the cool night air. It's not always serious. Sometimes you just need to let yourself enjoy the moment. Besides, how else are you going to learn? Sigzil, with his usual dry tone, added, You've got the right idea, Kaladin. You've made a lot of progress tonight. But remember, there's always more to learn. Don't let yourself get too cocky. Kaladin nodded, understanding the caution in Sigzil's words. I'm not getting cocky, just learning. I think I can start pushing it more, just a little. Syl fluttered beside him, her presence like a gentle breeze against his face. Don't rush, Kaladin. You have time. It's important to be patient with yourself, even when it's tempting to do more. He smiled at her words, grateful for her calm and steady influence. You're right, Syl. I'll take it slow. But that felt good. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting myself every step of the way. As he reached the bottom of the chasm, Kaladin paused, taking in the surrounding silence. The night was cool, the air crisp, with the faint scent of earth and stone, and for a moment it felt as though the world had paused. There was no rushing wind, No distant rumble of thunder, just the quiet camaraderie of the group. Lopen stretched dramatically, throwing his arms wide. That was the best night I've had in a while. You know, maybe I should get a spren too. Start learning how to jump around like you. Kaladin laughed softly, shaking his head. I don't think it works that way, Lopen. You'd need to bond with a spren, and even then, it's not something you can just learn overnight. Lopen's face twisted in mock disappointment. Aw, you're no fun, Cal. I was hoping you'd teach me how to jump like that. Sigzil couldn't suppress a smile as he continued walking toward the makeshift camp they had set up earlier. Maybe we'll just let Kaladin keep the Windrunner powers for now. We don't want to overload Lopen with too much excitement. Kaladin followed them, his mind still buzzing with the after effects of the night's training. He felt more connected to the Stormlight now, like it was a part of him that he could understand better. It had been a wild night, but in the best way possible. There had been moments of laughter, moments of pure discovery, and the thrill of simply pushing his own boundaries. He could still feel the hum of the Stormlight in his chest, like an extension of his heartbeat. As they neared the camp, Kaladin looked up toward the night sky, the vast expanse of darkness above, broken only by distant stars. It was hard not to wonder about what the future held, but in this moment, it didn't feel so heavy. They had learned something new together, and in the company of his friends, there was peace. Syl drifted beside him, her light flickering softly in the cool night air. You did well tonight, Kaladin. You've taken the first steps to mastering this power. Kaladin smiled, his thoughts turning toward the future. There's still a lot to learn, but I think I'm ready to face whatever comes next. You always were, Syl replied, her voice soft but certain. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about progress, and you've made a lot of progress tonight. As Kaladin sat down beside his friends around the small campfire, he realized something important. It wasn't the power he had gained that mattered most. It was the people beside him, the ones who stood by him, even when things seemed impossible. Sigzil, with his steady wisdom, Lopen, with his unending enthusiasm, and Syl, with her quiet strength. Together, they had discovered something new, and together, they would face whatever came next. The fire crackled softly, the warmth spreading across their small camp as the night stretched on. It wasn't about the destination anymore, Kaladin realized. It was about the journey, about the moments like this, learning, growing, laughing with friends in the quiet of the chasm. And for the first time in a long while, Kaladin felt like he had a place he belonged. Here, in the dark, with his friends and his spren, there was hope. Kaladin leaned back against the chasm wall, letting the cool stone press against his back as he listened to the quiet murmur of the campfire. The embers flickered in the dim light, casting dancing shadows against the rough rock. Lopen was still buzzing with energy, despite the late hour, while Sigzil sat with a more measured calm, watching the flames with quiet contemplation. Syl hovered near Kaladin's shoulder, her tiny form glowing softly. You're thinking again, she said, her voice lilting with amusement. Kaladin smirked. I'm always thinking. Yes, but you're thinking too hard. You should just enjoy the moment. She flitted in front of his face, grinning. You had fun tonight, didn't you? He sighed, but there was no real frustration behind it. Yeah, I did. Lopen flopped onto his back, staring up at the sliver of night sky visible through the jagged tops of the chasms. You know, I think I was meant for greatness. I mean, if I had powers like yours, Cal, I'd already be ruling the war camps by now. Sigzil snorted. Somehow, I doubt that. Kaladin chuckled. I don't think you'd enjoy the responsibility, Lopen. Lopen sat up, placing a hand on his chest as if wounded. Cal, I'm hurt. I am an incredibly responsible Herdazian. Syl landed on Kaladin's knee, crossing her tiny arms. That is an absolute lie. Lopen gasped. Syl! Betrayal! Kaladin shook his head, laughing softly. The warmth of the fire, the camaraderie, the ease of the moment. It was rare for things to feel this light. He let himself settle into it, the quiet hum of Stormlight still lingering within him, not in an urgent way, but a gentle, steady presence. It reminded him that he wasn't alone, that he had people here, people who cared. Sigzil leaned forward, poking at the fire with a stick. So, Kaladin, what's next? We've tested how far you can jump, how smooth you can land. What's the next step? Kaladin considered the question, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Maybe testing how long I can hold myself in the air. I don't think I can actually fly, but there has to be a way to extend the jumps. Syl tilted her head. Maybe it's about more than just jumping. Maybe there's another way to use the stormlight to stay up longer. Lopen perked up. Oh! What if you flap your arms really hard? That might help. Kaladin gave him a flat look. Lopen. Lopen spread his arms and flapped them dramatically. No, hear me out. It works for chickens. Sigzil sighed, rubbing his temples. You are not a chicken, Lopen. Lopen looked vaguely offended. Well, that's rude. I mean, I don't want to be a chicken, but it's a solid strategy. Kaladin shook his head, still grinning. I think I'll pass on that method. Your loss, Lopen muttered, reclining again. Kaladin exhaled slowly, looking back toward the chasm walls. He could feel the potential of the stormlight inside him, the way it responded to his will. There had to be something more to it, some way to not just leap, but sustain himself longer in the air. Maybe he wasn't ready for that yet, but the thought of discovering it filled him with a strange sense of excitement. For so long, he had been focused only on survival, on fighting, on staying ahead of the pain, the loss. But this was different. This was about learning, about growing into something more, and he wasn't doing it alone. He glanced at his friends, at Lopen's ridiculous grin, at Sigzil's steady, patient demeanor, at Syl, who was watching him with quiet understanding. Tomorrow night, he said finally, we'll try again. Sigzil nodded. Good, but for now, we should rest. It'll be dawn in a few hours. Lopen groaned dramatically. Ugh, fine, but only because I need to be well rested for my eventual wind-running career. Kaladin chuckled, shaking his head as he settled back against the rock, closing his eyes. The sounds of the chasm surrounded him, the distant drip of water, the crackle of the fire, the quiet breathing of his friends. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace. Syl whispered beside him, her voice barely more than a breeze. You're doing well, Kaladin. He let himself believe her. The next night found them back in the chasms, the air cool and thick with the scent of damp stone. A faint breeze whistled through the narrow spaces, whispering over jagged rocks and distant pools of still water. The moonlight barely reached them, but that only made it feel more like their own secret world, hidden away from the eyes of Sadeas's men. Kaladin breathed in deeply, drawing stormlight from the spheres they had stashed earlier. The familiar rush of energy filled his limbs, like waking up from a deep sleep, sharper, clearer. It pulsed inside him, eager, alive. Syl zipped through the air beside him, flickering between shapes. A ribbon of light, a tiny woman, a swirling breeze. "You're thinking again," she teased. "Less thinking, more doing." Lopen stretched his arms behind his head, completely at ease. "All right, Cal, what's tonight's plan? More jumping, more throwing yourself at the ground and hoping for the best?" Sigzil, more serious as always, adjusted his coat. "We should start by testing what happens when you try to hold yourself in the air, not just jump. You keep thinking of it like falling with control, but what if it's more than that?" Kaladin considered this, glancing up at the uneven walls of the chasm. The ledges were rough and broken, carved over centuries by wind and water. The first night had been about instinct, about learning how to survive the raw feeling of stormlight surging through him. But now, he wanted control. He took a running start and leapt toward the nearest ledge, stormlight streaming from his body like faint mist. The air bent around him, pushing him upward. His boots hit the rock, and for a moment, he just stood there, perpendicular to the ground. Lopen let out a long whistle. "Now that's unnatural." Kaladin grinned. He wasn't falling. He was standing, as if gravity had simply changed its mind. The stone beneath his feet felt solid, but only because he willed it to be. As soon as he let the thought slip, wondering if it was real, his foot lost its hold, and he tumbled backward. Syl darted beside him, laughing as he twisted midair, stormlight still clinging to his limbs. He let it push him, just enough to control the fall, landing in a low crouch on the ground below. Sigzil nodded approvingly. "Better. You're getting used to how it responds." Lopen, meanwhile, was clapping. Okay, but did you see how cool that looked? That's gotta be, like, at least a 5 on the Herdazian impressive feat scale." Kaladin dusted himself off, shaking his head. "It's not about looking cool, Lopen." "Then you're doing it wrong." Kaladin sighed, but he was still smiling. They spent the next hour testing the limits. Kaladin climbed the chasm walls, using the stormlight to hold himself at odd angles. He tried jumping, not just to land, but to hover, keeping the stormlight inside him, steady, focused. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. "You're overthinking," Syl pointed out, after another failed attempt to stay in the air. "You're trying to control it too much, like it's something separate from you." Kaladin sat on a rock, catching his breath. The stormlight was beginning to fade, the spheres around them dimming. "So what do I do?" "Stop fighting it." She landed on his knee, small and glowing, her expression serious for once. "Stormlight isn't just a tool, Kaladin. It's part of you now. Don't treat it like something you have to wrestle into place. Let it be natural." Kaladin frowned, rolling the thought over in his mind. Sigzil stood. "We should stop for tonight. We don't want to use up all our light before the morning." Lopen groaned. "But we were just getting to the good part. The part where Cal learns how to soar through the sky like some kind of majestic." Kaladin gave him a tired look. "Lopen." "Sky eel." Kaladin groaned. They started gathering the spent spheres, their glow now faint and dull. Kaladin felt drained, but not in a bad way. It was the exhaustion that came from effort, from learning something new. As they made their way back through the chasms, Kaladin glanced at the sky, at the tiny sliver of stars visible through the jagged opening above. He wasn't flying yet, but he would be. Syl drifted beside him, smiling. "You're getting closer." He nodded. He could feel it too. Tomorrow night, they would try again. The next night, the chasms greeted them with their familiar embrace of quiet shadows and cool stone. The war camps above bustled with the usual sounds of late-night activity, distant shouts, the occasional clank of metal. But down here, it was their own world. Hidden. Safe. Kaladin rolled his shoulders, the anticipation settling in his chest like a second heartbeat. He had spent the entire day thinking about Syl's words, about not forcing the Stormlight to obey, but instead letting it be a part of him. The idea felt strange. For so long, everything in his life had been a battle, something to endure, something to fight against. Could he really just let go? Syl hovered beside him, her tiny form glowing faintly in the dim light. "You're still thinking too much," she said, smirking. "I can practically hear your thoughts clanking around like a broken spear." Kaladin exhaled, shaking his head. "It's not that easy, Syl. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you can't do it." Sigzil and Lopen had already gathered in the clearing, their small fire crackling softly, its warmth barely enough to push back the night's chill. Lopen stretched his arms with exaggerated effort. "All right, bridge boy, time for you to defy all logic and reason again. What's the plan?" Kaladin eyed the chasm walls. "Tonight, I stop falling." Lopen squinted at him. "That is the exact opposite of how falling works." Kaladin ignored him, turning to Sigzil. "You said I was treating Stormlight like something external, like I had to control it. What do you think I should be doing instead?" Sigzil considered for a moment, tapping his chin. "You don't control breathing, do you? Your body just does it. Maybe this should be the same." Kaladin let that settle inside him. He had been clutching at Stormlight, forcing it to work for him. But maybe, just maybe, he had to trust it. He stepped forward, feeling the smooth stones beneath his boots. He inhaled, drawing in the Stormlight from the infused spheres in his pouch. It rushed into him, eager, thrumming with life. It wanted to be used. This time, he didn't command it. He let it flow. He bent his knees, focused, and jumped. Stormlight streamed from his skin, wrapping around him like an embrace. He felt the moment where he would normally begin to drop, but instead of forcing himself to stay up, he simply let himself be. And for the first time, he didn't just leap. He floated. The chasm floor fell away beneath him. He was in the air, not just jumping, not just falling with style, but hovering, held aloft by Stormlight itself. Lopen let out a strangled gasp. "Storms! Cal, you're—" Kaladin lost focus for a fraction of a second. The moment the doubt entered his mind, he dropped. He hit the ground hard, rolling with the impact. Stormlight cushioned the fall, but it still sent a sharp jolt up his spine. Syl giggled, landing beside him. "That was better." Lopen was still staring. "Better?" He was floating. Floating, Sig. That was at least a 9 on the Herdazian impressive feat scale. Sigzil, more measured, nodded. "You had it, Kaladin, until you let yourself hesitate." Kaladin sat up, catching his breath. The sensation still echoed in his bones. That weightlessness, that perfect, unshaken balance. He had felt it. He had been there. He looked at Syl. "I can do it again." She grinned. "I know." Lopen rubbed his hands together. All right. Do it again. But this time, let's see if we can get some tricks in. Maybe a slow spin. A heroic pose." Kaladin ignored him, pushing to his feet. The night wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Tonight, he had flown. Tomorrow, he would learn to stay in the air. Kaladin stood in the center of the chasm, his pulse steady, the stormlight within him still buzzing softly. The memory of floating lingered in his body, like a song half remembered, waiting to be sung again. He flexed his fingers, feeling the faint resistance of the air, the way the stormlight responded to his intent, shifting within him like a living thing. Syl hovered near his shoulder, her tiny form glowing with quiet excitement. "You're close," she whispered. "You felt it, didn't you? The moment when the ground stopped mattering?" He nodded. "I did." Lopen clapped his hands together. "Well, don't just stand there looking all dramatic. Get back up there, bridge boy." The people demand to see more. Sigzil raised an eyebrow. "What people?" Lopen gestured around the empty chasm. "The people, the winds, the spren, whoever's watching, probably some lost rockbuds who've never seen a windrunner before." He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the darkness. "You're welcome, rockbuds." Kaladin snorted, but rolled his shoulders, refocusing. "All right, let's go again." He took a breath, pulling in the stormlight from his pouch. The sensation was already becoming familiar. The way it filled him made him lighter, sharper, as though his body wasn't just his own, but something greater, something part of the wind itself. He bent his knees and jumped. This time, he didn't try to force it. He let the stormlight catch him, let it become part of the movement, rather than something he had to control. And just like before, he didn't fall. He floated. Lopen let out a whoop. "There it is! There it is!" Kaladin barely heard him. He was too focused on the way the stormlight shifted, how he could feel the air around him, not as resistance, but as something he could move through, something that accepted him. He tilted slightly forward, and his body responded, gliding just a fraction. His heart pounded. He tried tilting back, shifting his weight, without thinking too much about it. He moved, not just floating, drifting. Syl zipped around him, laughing. Yes, that's it." Lopen was hopping up and down. "Oh, Storms, you're actually flying. Sig, tell me I'm not hallucinating from too much chuta." Sigzil crossed his arms, nodding. "You're not hallucinating. It's real." Kaladin let out a slow breath, extending one hand, feeling the movement. He wasn't in complete control yet. He could feel the pull of gravity waiting for him to make a mistake. But he wasn't just a passenger anymore. He willed himself forward. The shift was small, barely noticeable, but he moved. He grinned. Then, a moment later, the doubt returned. Had he really done it? Or had it just been luck? The second the hesitation hit, the stormlight stuttered, and he dropped like a stone. Lopen yelped and jumped back as Kaladin hit the ground, rolling onto his back. Syl landed on his chest, grinning down at him. "You flew!" Kaladin let out a breathless chuckle. "I flew!" Lopen pointed at him. "You did! And it looked awesome. Not graceful, but awesome." Sigzil stepped closer. "You were in control. Not entirely, but enough. You're learning." Kaladin stared up at the sliver of sky above the chasm. He could still feel the stormlight inside him, could still remember that perfect moment where the air had held him, where he had moved with it instead of against it. Tomorrow, he would do it again, and next time, he wouldn't fall. The next night, Kaladin stood at the base of the chasm wall, rolling his shoulders as stormlight pulsed faintly beneath his skin. The cool air carried the scent of damp stone and distant moss, the quiet hum of nighttime life, barely audible beyond their little clearing. Lopen sat cross-legged on a nearby rock, watching with rapt attention. "All right, bridge boy, I've been thinking." "That's dangerous," Kaladin muttered, adjusting his stance. Listen, listen. Lopen waved a hand. You keep trying to float, but maybe you should think bigger. I mean, what if you just went straight up, like a larkin after a tasty bit of investiture? Sigzil sighed. Lopen, larkins don't fly straight up like arrows. Lopen pointed at Kaladin. Yeah, but he does. Kaladin considered it. Up until now, he had been easing into the stormlight, testing his control in slow, careful increments. But maybe that was the problem. He was treating it like something delicate, something that required hesitation. Stormlight wasn't delicate. It was the power of a storm, wild and unrelenting. Syl danced through the air, her tiny form pulsing with excitement. You're thinking about it again. Kaladin let out a breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He could feel the stormlight inside him, thrumming like a second heartbeat, eager, restless. All right. No more hesitation. He took a deep breath, bent his knees, and leapt. The stormlight surged through him, responding to his intent. And this time, he didn't just lift off the ground. He shot upward like a thrown spear. Wind rushed past his face as he soared up the side of the chasm, the rock walls blurring in his peripheral vision. For one thrilling, terrifying moment, he felt weightless, felt the stormlight carrying him higher, higher. Then doubt hit him like a hammer. What if he lost control? What if he didn't know how to stop? That tiny crack in his confidence was all it took. The stormlight wavered, and suddenly he was falling. The walls of the chasm rushed past as gravity reclaimed him. His stomach lurched, the wind howled in his ears, and... Kaladin! Syl's voice cut through the rush of air. Instinct took over. He flared the stormlight again, willing himself to push against the fall, to slow, and it worked. His descent slowed, the impact softening as he hit the chasm floor in a low crouch, stormlight puffing from his skin. Lopen let out a strangled laugh. Stormfather's left boot. That was terrifying. Sigzil, though visibly impressed, crossed his arms. That was reckless. Kaladin straightened, breath coming fast, heart pounding. But it worked. Syl landed on his shoulder, grinning. You flew, and you didn't break anything. Kaladin let out a slow breath, his pulse finally steadying. He had done it. It had been messy, uncontrolled, but for those few precious moments, he had truly flown. Lopen nudged Sigzil. I say, we call this one a win. Sigzil sighed. Only because he didn't die. Kaladin glanced up at the sky, the sliver of stars framed between the chasm walls. He wasn't just jumping anymore. He wasn't just floating. He was learning to command the wind. Tomorrow, he would go even higher. The next night, the chasms felt different. The familiar damp air, the cool stone underfoot, and the distant echo of dripping water remained unchanged. But something had shifted within Kaladin. He stood at the center of their little training ground, his body thrumming with stormlight, his heartbeat steady. He wasn't here to test his powers anymore. He was here to master them. Lopen stretched his arms behind his head, grinning. All right, bridge boy, what's the goal tonight? More impressive falling? Maybe a mid-air backflip? I'd respect a backflip. Kaladin smirked, tightening his grip on the sphere pouch at his belt. No more falling. Tonight, I figure out how to stay in the air. Sigzil nodded, thoughtful. You've proven you can go up, and you've proven you can slow yourself down. Now, you need control. Kaladin inhaled sharply, drawing in the stormlight. The now familiar rush filled him, making his skin glow faintly, sharpening the world around him. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pushed off the ground. and soared. The chasm floor shrank beneath him as he launched upward, but unlike before, he didn't let the fear creep in. He didn't let doubt cut through the moment. Instead, he focused on the feeling, on the way the stormlight surged through him, responding to his will. Higher. The walls blurred as he climbed, air whipping past, cool and electric. He reached the halfway point of the chasm wall, higher than he had ever gone before, and then he tilted. For a heart-stopping moment, panic threatened to take hold. He was drifting off balance, beginning to spiral. Syl zipped around him, her voice urgent. "Don't fight it. Feel the wind. Move with it." Kaladin adjusted, shifting his weight, letting his body respond instinctively instead of overthinking. And suddenly, the spin smoothed into a controlled glide. He angled himself, testing the movement, letting the wind guide him instead of resisting it. He was flying, not just floating, not just leaping, actually flying. Below, Lopen was screaming in delight. "Storms! Look at him! Look at him go!" Sigzil shaded his eyes with one hand, watching intently. "He's controlling it now." Kaladin angled downward, testing his ability to descend without simply falling. The stormlight responded, easing him into a slow, smooth glide back toward the chasm floor. He touched down lightly, boots barely making a sound on the stone. He grinned, exhilarated. Syl landed on his shoulder, beaming. Now that was flying. Lopen ran up, hands on his head. "Cal, you were a storming sky eel. No, better than a sky eel. I demand to see tricks next time. Maybe a loop." Sigzil exhaled, shaking his head, but smiling. "That was impressive. You looked comfortable up there." Kaladin nodded, flexing his fingers. "I was." He had done it. The doubts, the fear, the hesitation, he had left them behind. Tomorrow, he would push even further. Tomorrow, the sky would be his. The final night in the chasms felt different. The quiet hum of distant cremlings, the cool dampness of the stone, the whisper of the wind threading through the darkness. It all felt sharper, more alive. Or maybe that was just the stormlight, coursing through Kaladin's veins like a second heartbeat, filling him with something that was no longer just energy, but certainty. Lopen stood nearby, arms crossed, nodding to himself. "All right, gents, tonight's the night. Bridgeboy becomes full-fledged Stormman. Maybe he even ascends, and we all bow before him." Sigzil sighed. "He's not a herald, Lopen." "Yet," Lopen muttered. Kaladin chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's focus on getting me to stay up there longer first." Syl floated beside him, her form shifting from a ribbon of light to a tiny person, resting lightly on his shoulder. "You've got this. You already did it last night. Now, just make it second nature." Kaladin inhaled, pulling in the stormlight. It was so familiar now, so natural, that he almost didn't think about it, like breathing. And then he moved. With a push, he launched into the air, but this time there was no fear, no uncertainty. He controlled it. The stormlight carried him upward, higher than before, and he let himself adjust to the feeling, experimenting with small shifts in his body. He leaned forward, and the wind carried him into a slow, gliding arc. Then he angled back, pushing upward again, higher, past the halfway point of the chasm walls. Lopen whooped from below. "There he goes. Look at our boy go." Kaladin grinned, angling into a dive. But it wasn't uncontrolled this time. He let the wind move around him, let the stormlight hold him steady. He pulled up at the last moment, gliding back into the air, testing his control. For the first time, it wasn't just an experiment. It wasn't just training. It was flying. He tilted, trying a tight turn, too sharp, almost losing his balance. But instead of panicking, he compensated, adjusting his posture, steadying himself. The stormlight carried him. He wasn't just using it, he was moving with it, understanding it. Syl zipped around him in excitement. Yes! Yes! That's it! Kaladin laughed, the sheer joy of it filling him. He let himself drift in slow circles, playing with the air, feeling the wind shift around him. Then finally, he let himself descend, coming down in a smooth, controlled landing. He didn't stumble, didn't drop, just touched down, light as a feather. Lopen was already sprinting toward him. Cal! Storms, that was beautiful. You should have seen yourself. You were like, whoosh, and then, he made an exaggerated diving motion, and then, bam, like a sky gill, but less slimy. Sigzil approached, arms crossed, a small smile on his lips. That was perfect control. You figured it out. Kaladin exhaled, the stormlight settling within him, still thrumming, but calm. He looked up at the narrow stretch of sky above, the stars peeking through. Syl landed on his shoulder, grinning. You did it. Kaladin smiled. Yeah. Tomorrow, he wouldn't need to come down to the chasms to practice. Tomorrow, he would take to the skies whenever he wanted. Tomorrow, he would be free.